Hi, and welcome to today's Engaging for Missouri webinar. I'm Alice Roach from the Division of Applied Social Sciences at the University of Missouri, and I'll be your host today. With each of these 30-minute webinars, we intend to share research-based insights that leaders like you can apply in your own work to benefit and strengthen the state's agriculture and food system, hospitality sector, and communities. For today's webinar, we have Dr. Mary Stegmaier here to present about how democracies respond during crisis and the implications for international trade. Before I invite Dr. Stegmaier to begin, I want to share a few housekeeping items. First, we'll close the webinar today with a question and answer session. Those of you who connected to today's webinar via your computer can submit your comments in the chat screen and your questions there too. To open that chat screen, you can just click the chat button that you see at the bottom of your Zoom window, and then you'll see a chat screen open to the right side of your screen. If you join by phone today, then you can connect with us and ask questions via email. You can send me your emails at roacham@missouri.edu. Second, all attendees are muted and may not start their video. Third, if you encounter any technical difficulties during today's webinar, then you can let me know by submitting a comment in the chat screen, or you can also send me an email at roacham@missouri.edu. Fourth, we will make a recorded copy of the webinar available to you. You can look for an email from Zoom in about a day from now with a link to that recording. Additionally, we have all of our previous Engaging for Missouri webinars available on our division's YouTube page. So with that, we'll transition to the topic of today's webinar titled How Democracies Respond During Crisis and Implications for International Trade. Presenting on this topic is Dr. Mary Stegmaier, who is an associate professor with the Truman School of Public Affairs and MU's interim vice provost for international programs. So thank you, Mary, for presenting today. If you could please start your video and unmute your microphone, then we can begin your presentation.
Great, thank you, Alice. So good morning, everyone. I'm really delighted to be here today to discuss how democracies respond during crisis. Oops, sorry, some technical difficulties. So what I'm going to talk about today in terms of how democracies respond is two primary factors, the public's response and related to this, the leadership's response. So in thinking about COVID-19 and how it impacts approval ratings, so when we think about the public's response, we'll be talking about leader approval ratings. We can look at rally around the flag effects, what is termed the authoritarian reflex, and we'll also look at some differences across countries. In terms of the leadership's response, how leaders respond is impacted by how the public responds. What is the public's level of support? In general, we see during times of crisis an expansion of government powers. But in a few cases, one that we'll look at today of Hungary, we see outright power grabs by leaders. And then we'll consider what this could mean for international trade. Let's begin by looking at something many of us are familiar with, and that is US presidential approval ratings. This graph shows Gallup public opinion polls from the Truman presidency all the way through the Trump presidency. And we see fluctuations in approval over time, looking at any particular presidential administration, but also over the course of the series. As political scientists, we ask questions about what moves presidential approval. So when we look at this chart, we see that at the beginning of a new administration, right after that president has been inaugurated, there is an elevated level of support for that person. The public is excited to have a new leader. This person just won the election. This is what we call the honeymoon effect. Typically in the first few months of a president's term, we see elevated approval ratings, but then once that president gets down to actually governing and things become controversial, we see a decline in approval ratings, but then also fluctuations due to some other factors. Leadership is one factor, how people view, how the public views the president as a leader. But also a really important factor is economic conditions. So much of my own research focuses on how the economy affects government support as well as elections. So as we would expect, when economic times are prosperous, presidential approval ratings increase, and when the economy is in decline or in recession, we see a decline in approval. Another factor is times of war. Immediately at this onset of a war, because the public perceives a threat, there can be a rally around the flag effect. But then over time, as there are casualties of the war, if there are perceptions that the president's policies are not going as planned, then we can see a decline, then we might see a decline in support. Rally around the flag effects happen when there is a lot of national attention to a particular event that unifies the public. So these can be both positive things, such as a victory in a war. The capturing of Osama bin Laden is an example of this, things that elicit national pride. But they are also negative things, negative events, such as a terror attack. September 11th, if you look during the second President Bush's administration, you see very early on the highest point on this presidential approval series occurred in the week of September 11th, as the American public unified in support of the president. National disasters can generate a rally around the flag effect, as can a pandemic, if the public is perceiving this as a threat to the nation's health and safety. Now let's move to another democracy, the UK. This presents Prime Minister Boris Johnson's approval ratings from July through late March. So this ends on about March 24th, this series. So the blue line is his approval rating, and you see that it fluctuates over time. One point in time that's important on this graph is December. So in December, the UK had parliamentary elections, which Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party won a solid majority in. And so we see that prior to December, his approval rating is fluctuating around maybe 41, 42%. In this period after the elections, his approval rating is fluctuating around 46, 47%. Then in the middle of March, it was March 16th, when the UK announced, and Boris Johnson announced restrictions, public restrictions due to the coronavirus. Prior to that, in early March, some of the other European countries were issuing lockdown orders and had a strong response to COVID-19. But the UK was holding off on this. And while his support was remaining steady, as the virus spread in the UK in early March, early to mid-March, there was greater public criticism. And once these restrictions were announced and the UK was essentially going to battle against COVID-19, we see this strong rally around the flag effect in the UK. So his approval ratings jumped from around 46% to about 61% by March 24th. You might wonder whether this increase is also due to Boris Johnson's announcement when he was diagnosed with COVID-19, but that happened shortly after this. That announcement came on March 27th. So this is another example of a rally around the flag impact here in the UK. One of the things that's important to note, what we talked about in the case of the US presidential approval rating, is the same kind of factors that move approval ratings in the US also apply to most other democracies, that the economy shapes presidential or prime minister or chancellor approval, that war, rally around the flag effects, leadership and perceptions of leadership also matter. This next slide shows a graphic that has approval ratings for a number of world leaders. What I want you to see in this is that approval ratings for world leaders vary quite dramatically. The top line is Prime Minister Modi in India, that's the top blue line, where his approval rating is hovering around 75% most of the time, and then gets elevated in March, where we then see at the lowest level of approval rating, at least among these leaders, at the beginning of this chart, is President Macron from France. In the first couple of months on this graphic, we see sort of a gentle fluctuation of approval ratings. But once we hit March 11th is the date that the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a pandemic, and we see greater change happening after that date. In many of these cases, the executives, the leaders of these countries experienced a boost in their approval rate. This next chart shows a different perspective on the impact of COVID-19 on approval. So you see on the horizontal axis, this starts at point 0, and point 0 is March 11th, the date that the pandemic was declared. And this then shows the change in percentage points, the percentage point change in approval ratings that occurred over the following 3.5 weeks for the leaders of these countries. We see some pretty sizable increases in support for leaders in Australia, Canada, Britain, Germany. Macron in France also received a boost, not as high as some of the others. President Trump had a quite modest boost, but a small boost nonetheless. And then Prime Minister, the leader in Japan, and Bolsonaro in Brazil, over the course of this time period, ending up at a lower position than they were the day that the pandemic was declared. The point here is that while on average we see a boost in approval ratings, not all leaders have experienced this boost. So this suggests to us that there are other factors, such as a leader showing strong leadership skills, management skills, but then also perhaps respecting democracy in some of these instances that will also impact whether there is a rally effect and how strong that rally effect is. Leader support also translates into party support. This is an example from Germany. So Chancellor Angela Merkel has received a sizable boost for her, what the German public perceives quite effective management and leadership in fighting COVID-19. This also translates to then support for her party. This graphic comes from a question that the public is asked: if an election were held this weekend, which party would you vote for? The CDU, the Christian Democratic Party, is Angela Merkel's party, and we see that in mid-March, there's quite a substantial increase in their support. Their coalition partner, the SPD, which is the reddish pinkish line on here, they have seen a small boost, but it's not nearly the size of boost that the CDU has experienced as Chancellor Merkel is their leader. Another question for us is, how might leader approval evolve as the crisis continues? We see oftentimes that the rally around the flag effect wanes over time. Here I've presented President Bush's job approval ratings over the course of his term. We see this big jump on September 11th, 2001, where his approval rating jumped from 51% to essentially 90%. This is the highest approval rating Gallup has ever recorded for a president. This is a very strong rally around the flag effect. The American public felt rightfully so that there was an extreme threat against our country. People are supporting our leader in an effort to fight, in this case, terrorism. But over time, after that initial shock of the event, the initial threat, other factors become or return to their dominance in terms of affecting presidential approval ratings. So the effectiveness of leadership and economic conditions returning to moving presidential approval rates. As we think about COVID-19, we might expect over time that for many leaders, this rally around the flag effect will begin to taper off, but perhaps if they're showing strong leadership, that might not always be the case. So how do leaders respond to crisis? In cases where leaders have experienced high approval ratings, this can give them greater authority to enact their priority policies. It's easier to get legislation passed. It's easier to get public buy-in to those policies. There's also what political scientists refer to as the authoritarian reflex. This is an instinctive response on the part of individuals that when we feel threatened, like we feel threatened in a pandemic, or if we feel threatened by terrorism, that we want a strong leader and that we are willing to give up some of our freedoms or rights in order to combat this threat. So that's not for everybody, of course, but this is the instinctive response. And this is why we oftentimes see an expansion of government power during times of crisis. And in some instances, we can see what have become termed as coronavirus coups. The idea here is that if leaders, even in democracies, have authoritarian tendencies, they could take advantage of the situation and grab power or consolidate power in ways that are not democratic. So the prime example of this currently is in Hungary, where Prime Minister Viktor Orban, he has been Prime Minister since 2010. He had had a previous stint as Prime Minister before that as well. But over the past 10 years that he's been in power, Hungary has seen a backsliding of democracy. And by this year and over this time period, we as political scientists would consider the changes, the limits on the free press, the restrictions on the judiciary that have been imposed. Hungary has become known as an illiberal democracy. Notably, on March 30th, with the goal of fighting the coronavirus, the parliament gave Viktor Orban the power to rule by decree. So he doesn't need parliamentary approval for this. And in addition to this, there is no expiration date on this power for him to rule by decree. So in essence, this makes him an autocrat and calls into question whether Hungary is still a democracy. Interestingly, these changes have not translated into a change in his party's support. On April 19th, his party is Fidesz. It's the top line here, that's in gold. Its party support has remained pretty stable over the course of this chart, which started in November. So let's think briefly about what are the implications for international trade. It might lead to a reevaluation of globalization. So COVID-19 has restricted the movements of people and limited the movement of goods. It's disrupted the supply chains. It's led to closures of factories and plants. So it may get politicians and leaders to think through, how much do we want to continue with globalization? Do we prefer to protect ourselves and produce goods here? Leaders who have protectionist views on trade, it might make it easier for them to implement their policies, especially if they have strong public support due to the rally around the flag effects. If there are countries that become more authoritarian, this could impact trade relations, especially if there are sanctions that are put in place, or if the US or other countries decide that they prefer not to trade with them. And then there's a question about what might happen within the European Union. The European Union itself is a trading bloc, but the response to COVID-19 has been on a country-by-country basis, and there hasn't been much of a unified European Union response. And so will, over time, the European Union cooperate more, or will this lead to the European Union sort of falling apart or tearing apart? So with that, I will conclude. The coronavirus presents many interesting questions for those of us who work in the social sciences. Many of these are still questions today that we will have plenty of time to analyze, but interesting to think about as we endure these pretty challenging times. Thank you so much.
Great, Mary. Thank you so much for that presentation. We do have time for some questions, so if you have questions, please just enter them into the chat screen, or you can also send me an email. To get started, we do have a question here about, can you explain Justin Trudeau's growing rate of approval in Canada?
I don't know so much about the particulars of the Canadian approach, so that's something that I would actually have to look more into. I know in some cases why approval has increased or decreased. In some countries, such as Germany, for example, I think a lot of credit has been given to Angela Merkel. She herself is a scientist. She's taken a pretty serious approach to managing the crisis. She's been cautious at times, and they have used also federalism, the kind of system we have, in a pretty effective way. But I don't know exactly the details in Canada.
Great. I have a question. You mentioned globalization on your final slide. So how is coronavirus likely to change, or how has it changed Americans' views of globalization, and what are the related economic effects?
I think that's a terrific question. We'll have to wait and see as part of my response to that, but I think that many Americans perceive, like, to the extent that we are reliant on other countries for certain goods, particularly medical equipment, that right now, as trade has slowed, as there are demands for goods in all of these countries, medical supplies in all countries, that we are now competing in ways that we hadn't envisioned before to get the supplies that we need. And as this continues, many people will probably question whether or not it's actually a great idea to be so reliant on other countries for essential supplies and materials.
Great. There's a question here about, does a global threat like the coronavirus offset in any way protectionism?
I guess I'd wonder about offsetting protectionism. So I think one of the things that the coronavirus can do is it can increase politicians' propensity to support protectionist policies, but we can also think about this in terms of isolationist policies versus international policies. And we might see over time greater cooperation across countries in order to fight the coronavirus, that we can't have our borders sealed or closed endlessly or in perpetuity, that we need to find ways to work together to figure out how to mitigate the risks of the coronavirus while still engaging in trade, in other kinds of interactions with other countries.
Great. A question here is about the US midterm elections appear to reflect disapproval of authoritarian tendencies in US leadership, but the opposite trend seems to be appearing in Hungary. So what is the perspective of the Hungarian Parliament? Are they still in control?
Good question. So in Hungary, Viktor Orban has managed to secure this power because his party for a number of years has had a majority, or now an overwhelming majority, of seats in parliament. So they've managed to do this not quite through rigging the elections, but by creating an electoral system that really accentuates majorities. He has also put restrictions on journalists. Right now, journalists cannot, the law is they cannot be spreading misinformation. No one can spread misinformation about COVID-19. Of course, we can all agree that misinformation or false news about this is not helpful for the health of societies. But this is also viewed as a strategy or a tactic that he's using to suppress criticism of his handling of the coronavirus, shortages at hospitals, anything that might be critical of his government.
Okay. So for some US industries, including agriculture, trade is important to growing overall market opportunities. So if the US finds itself seeking trade deals with more authoritarian leaders throughout the world, then what's the right approach? Will we see more bilateral trade agreements, or are multilateral trade agreements still a possibility?
Mm-hmm. So in the international relations literature, we know that democracies are more likely to trade with each other. We have stronger ties, we share intelligence with them, we have international agreements with them, things like NATO, for example, or the European Union, NAFTA. So this facilitates trade among like-minded countries. I think in instances where democracies are engaging in relations with non-democracies, this becomes trickier, and we're more likely to see bilateral agreements in these cases because different countries are finding ways or have particular ways that they want to protect themselves, and that makes multilateral agreements more challenging.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. In non-democracies, might government cover-ups of real statistics lead to public pressure for greater transparency and then also democracy?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we haven't talked much today about how non-democracies are responding, countries like China or Russia, for example, or Rwanda. these countries, some of these countries are really implementing strategies, surveillance strategies, and tracking of people, using the military in ways that will allow them, not just during the time of this crisis, but in the future, to have greater control over the public, to the extent that they don't necessarily have free media. It's hard for the media to share this information with the public, to be critical of the government, to point out what the long-term implications of this are. So the answer to that, I think, will depend upon how severe the COVID-19 crisis is in the country, whether or not the government can reasonably cover this up, or whether so many people know so many other people who pass away from the virus or who have really severe complications of the virus. It also depends upon how or whether governments have control over social media, because social media, as we know in the US, is another way of sharing information and really spreading information. In non-democracies, this can be one of the avenues to undermine authoritarian governments.
Great. Well, thank you, Mary, for sharing today's really terrific webinar presentation. And thank you to our audience too. When you exit Zoom, you'll see a post-webinar survey will load in your browser. If you could please consider responding, we'll use the results to improve the webinar experience and also brainstorm future webinar topics. Again, you should receive a recorded copy of today's webinar via your email in about a day from now. So we'll conclude this week's Engaging for Missouri webinar schedule on Friday. On Friday at 10 a.m., Drew Bunton with the Missouri Department of Natural Resources and Chris Clanklin with the Missouri Department of Agriculture will speak about the 2019 Coordinated Flood Response and Building Resiliency for the Future. Again, thanks for joining us, and I hope you have a nice day.
Thank you. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.